So I was asked to select a reading that was inspiring to me and in connection to the time in which we are living, and obviously connected to this quarantine world. And I decided to read this essay that is called A Handful of Walnuts by Ahmed Errachidi, because Ahmed Errachidi was held in Guantanamo in extrajudicial detainment for 5 years before he was released, and obviously he was wrongly detained. And when he was released, he started to write his memoir that is also published in a book. And I'm reading one short essay, part of that, like it was published before the book, and that was published in Granta in the number that is called 10 Years Later. So for me, what was interesting is to think about isolation. Obviously, we have been talking about self-isolation a lot recently, but I wanted to reflect further in the question of isolation. And the essay by Errachidi brings light into a completely different understanding of what it means to be isolated. But still, even if it's extremely difficult situation the one is describing, at the same time it's extremely hopeful the way in which he talks, and it's an extremely beautiful text. So I hope you enjoy it, despite my Spanish accent, so I will do my best to keep the standard on an English that might be understood even by British people, but yeah, I apologize in advance for this. So yeah, I think I'm gonna start, if you don't mind. So it's A Handful of Walnuts by Ahmed Errachidi. This is how life in Guantanamo was, being moved from prison to prison, from camp to camp. After the deaths of the 3 brothers, they moved me to Camp 5, where the cells were made of concrete and completely sealed. In the middle of the rear wall, there was a window of opaque glass that allowed some light to come through. I had found a clear area about the size of a head of a matchstick in the top corner of this window. From this tiny spot, I could see out. I would stand on the concrete bed and watch the sun, the blue sky, the clouds, and even the birds, trees, and hills. After spending 3 years in segregation, I felt lucky at this good fortune. This is how it began. When the events of 11 September took place, I was sat with a colleague in a cafe opposite our restaurant in northwest London. We watched, with horror and shock, the events unfold before our eyes. Soon afterwards, I traveled to Islamabad to scout the silver markets. Everybody was talking about the human catastrophe that would follow should America bomb Afghanistan. When I returned to my lodgings, I would watch the news and see the refugees, most of them women, children, and old people. After 10 days, I decided I had to help, somehow. I caught a taxi in Peshawar and asked the driver to take me to Torkham, a border crossing between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Throughout the journey, we saw trucks and buses full beyond capacity, traveling in the opposite direction. Even the roofs were crammed with refugees. We reached Torkham, a few small houses surrounded by mountains, just before sunset. The driver showed me a man who could get me into Afghanistan. We decided to have dinner in Torkham and then cross the borders at night. The night had cast sheer darkness across the mountains surrounding us, adding to their enormity and vastness. We set out walking through the valley of stones. The man was carrying my bag, and after about 10 minutes, we reached the main road. There were some small shops by the road, and he said, "You are now in Afghanistan." I looked around and saw some huge dark mountains, like giant creatures surrounding me. I never felt that I was in danger. On the contrary, I felt full of life because I had crossed the borders and valleys to save lives. I stayed there for some 2 weeks, cooking for the refugees. One sunny morning, I heard the sound of an American F-16 skimming the skies. I saw the missile before hearing an enormous explosion. The target was a bus carrying civilian passengers. The bus was hardly recognizable. Imagine a can crushed by the wheels of a car. Inside and around it were the torn limbs of men, women, and children. I saw a woman whose skull had been smashed. Her brain and hair were burning. Shoes and belongings were thrown everywhere. It was a scene that time will not erase from my memory. I came back to Pakistan across those mountains and valleys with a mass exodus from Afghanistan. Every time we came to a village, we would stay for a few days because we faced the twin dangers of bombardment and the Pakistani army, who were handing over people escaping Afghanistan to the Americans in exchange for money, especially the Arabs among us. We reached a place called Banu, and I, together with 4 other refugees, got into a car headed to Lahore. I wanted to reach Pakistani city so that I could call my family and check on them. But we had a traffic accident on the way. The driver and his friend jumped out of the car and fled. Some policemen climbed into our car and took us to the police station. I couldn't digest all the events that were taking place in quick succession. I remember that moment. It was as if the scorpions of time had momentarily left their path. The sun was high in the sky, and an inescapable fate had befallen me. The police brought us blindfolded to the intelligence services prison in Lahore. They promised that they would send me home after making the necessary travel arrangements with the embassy. 3 weeks later, an FBI team arrived and interrogated me inside the prison. They took my fingerprints and photograph to ensure, they said, that I was not on the FBI wanted list. The Pakistanis told me the checks would only take 2 or 3 days. 44 days later, they took 7 of us to the airport. Even then, the Pakistanis claimed that they were taking me home. We waited at the Islamabad airport, shackled in handcuffs and leg irons, with black hoods over our heads. Hours later, I heard American accents. I heard the sound of money changing hands, and I knew that we were being bought and sold in the diplomatic lounge at Islamabad airport. The soldiers took us one by one out, replacing our Pakistani hoods and chains with American ones. In the plane, they shackled us even tighter until we were like insects in a spider's web. When we arrived, they pulled us down the runway, the soldiers singing and cheering. The only word I remembered from their song is Taliban, Taliban. They bait us. I heard one of them laughing and saying to another, "Leave this short one for me, he's my share." This was Bagram. They ordered us to lie on the floor, beat us, and threw liquid at us. I was cold and noisy from aircraft turbines. I bumped into one of the soldiers and instinctively said sorry in English. "Who speaks English?" one of them asked. "Me," I replied. "We have someone who speaks English with us," he said to his friends. Then he came close and asked, "Are you scared?" At about 2 in the morning, I was finally put in a barbed wire cage. It was hard to hear anything because of the generators. By day and by night, they will generate electricity and drown our screams. There were 7 of us in the cage. Our hands and feet were shackled throughout our entire 19-day stay in Bagram. I started to cooperate with people from the FBI, CIA, the US military intelligence, and the British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6. We arrived at Kandahar in the same manner as we arrived at Bagram, except that it was even harsher. We were left lying on the cold runway for a long time, while the soldiers walked on our heads with their boots on, saying, "Are you the ones who came to fight us?" There were dogs everywhere, barking. They cut my clothes off with scissors while I was face down. They took us away one by one. When my turn came, they took me inside a tent and sat me on my chair. They took off my hood. I saw my friends naked, tied to chairs. They had already finished shaving their heads and beards and were replacing the black hoods over their heads. I started crying when I saw them naked and shackled with black hoods. The soldiers were laughing and taking photos. The floor of the tent was covered with hair. They started to shave me. When they finished, they threw me to the ground and put me in some blue prison clothes. They could not find shoes my size, so they forced on a pair of shoes that were too small. They dragged me away to an old hangar, threw me on the sandy floor, and took off my hood and handcuffs. They tried to take off my leg irons too, but they were too tight against my feet and they couldn't remove them. So they left me in my leg irons and said, "Don't talk," before leaving. I looked around me. There were about 10 cages and 2 guard towers. It was dawn, and some of the prisoners were walking in their cages. Some were looking at me, but no one talked. I prayed a dawn prayer in my leg irons. When I finished, I found a blanket and an iron bucket, which was a toilet. I got under the blanket to sleep. I walked to the shouts of soldiers coming with saws to cut off my leg irons. They still couldn't remove them as they were attached to my skin and had to stop cutting when they saw blood. They came back with pliers to cut them, which didn't work either. I was rolling on the ground, screaming with pain. I stayed in Kandahar for nearly 2 months. The whole time, they did not allow us to use water for washing our hands or faces. Despite sanctions, prisoners concealed by their friends would from time to time pour a bottle of water on their bodies to wash. Finally, my interrogator told me that soon I will travel to a distant place by the sea. I will be offered Arabic bread and good food. There are people there, he said, who want to ask you some questions. You will stay there for 3 months. Then they will give you 500 bucks and a bus ticket to travel back to your country and family. Guantanamo. My block was made of metal, like a giant shipping container. The area of each cell was approximately 7 by 9 feet, and there were 48 cells in the block, enclosed with steel mesh. There was a mesh window in the metal wall. By the window, there was an open Turkish-style lavatory. To the right, there was a small metal wash basin. To the left, a metal bed. The floor was metal too, and so was the ceiling. If the bed had been a bath, the cell would have been a medium-sized bathroom. There was a slot in the middle of the door from where the prisoner would collect his food, clothes, and medicines. From there, also, he was shackled before any contact with the guards. There was another opening at the bottom of the door from which they shackled the prisoner's feet. Every 6 months or so, the soldiers and interrogators will change, and fresh rounds of interrogations will begin. After some time, I came to believe that the purpose of the interrogations was not to determine innocence or guilt, but rather to train the interrogators. Guantanamo had become a training school for new interrogators. I was asked the same questions again and again for a period of 5 years by a succession of interrogators. If a prisoner refused to speak, the interrogators will tempt him with good food or chocolates or books. If that didn't work, they used methods of coercion, sleep deprivation, and exposure to extreme cold. We were in the Oscar punishment block when Farouk's turn came. The interrogators stapled him to a chair in the cold room for 36 hours and kept him awake. Then they returned him to his cell. Every hour, just as he fell asleep, they took him to another cell. Then he was moved back to the interrogation room to remain there for another 36 hours. We saw our friend in torment and decided to put an end to his suffering. As was the custom, whenever the prisoners wanted to fend off injustice, we resorted to a protest to put pressure on the camp administration. We decided, therefore, to refrain from returning the paper plates and plastic spoons after dinner. We told the soldiers that we would not return them until Farouk was returned to us and was allowed to sleep. Inevitably, a confrontation ensued. 2 divisions of the Emergency Reaction Force entered the war wearing black protective gear. They walked into a dance rhythm to cast fear into us. All of them raised their feet at once and then struck the metal floor of the ward hard with the military boots. This terrifying dance shook every prisoner, telling him that no, there was no escape. At the time we were collectively engaged in the evening prayer, they stormed the cells as we prayed. They began with the cell number 1. I was in the cell number 19, and when my turn came, the officer gave me the last warning. I said, no, I'm one of them. As they opened the door, however, by luck I was able to push them away and get out of the cell. I ran out of the corridor without shackles or chains while they surrounded me and tried to drop me to the ground. The scene was like a match of American football. On one side, in military kit against one man in an orange kit. The prisoners watched in amazement and cheered by beating on the doors of their cells. It only lasted a few seconds. They dropped me in the middle of the corridor and rained beatings down on me. That night they used gas and dogs and the noise of ventilation fans and mechanical vacuums to drown the screams of prisoners. Many of the prisoners suffered injury, and one of us was beaten by dogs. When they finished taking the spoons and plates from the prisoners' cells, they still wanted to punish us, so that there will be no protest again. But in the world of punishments, we did not have anything left to be deprived of, except our daily 10 sheets of toilet paper each. Those were taken away as a collective punishment. I love to entertain the other prisoners, particularly in the isolation wards where we will spend months. Whenever circumstances permitted, and we were able to hear each other, I will ask them to sit down in their cells and listen to me as I describe to them some delicious meals, to imagine that they were guests in my house in Morocco, sitting around a large dining table. I will describe different types of delicious seafood. There was fish, fried, grilled, or roasted. In all, an array of 7 different types of fish surrounded by smaller dishes filled with all types of salads, chips, and various salsas. And the script described roasted chicken and oven-roasted lamb, fruit, juices, and desserts. After describing all the food, I will say, why don't we take a short siesta now and sleep a little? After a few hours, I will hear the prisoners calling out to me, oh, Abu Imran, this siesta has been a long one. Now can we come back to your dining table? And then we will laugh. The visitors. Visitors will come 3 times a day after every meal. They will come by the dozens, and I will wait eagerly for them. I will sit with them, thoroughly enjoying their company. I spent long hours with them, and yet did not get bored. They will come and give us hope that life had not come to a halt. Every time I saw them, I felt comfortable. They walked so quietly that the guards didn't know they were there, otherwise they would have been eliminated. I'm talking about the wonderful nation of ants. These beautiful creatures will visit me in my steel prison, bringing hope and life. I secretly saved food for them in a corner. If the guards saw them, they will either spray them with pesticide or crush them beneath their military boots. I will get angry and shout them, don't not the ants have a right to life? They do not trouble you, so why do you want to kill them? When the soldiers found out that we fed the ants, they punished us by cutting our rations. That didn't stop me from keeping ants in my cell. I observed them and studied their way of life every day. I would sometimes leave them a peanut whenever available. I split the bean in 2 halves and left each half on the floor with the flat side down. The ants will come and eat the entire bean from the inside, leaving the skin as it had been left for them. If you saw it, you wouldn't know that the inside had been eaten until you turned it over to find it empty. I found it amusing. Whenever I put food in the corner, one of the ants will come to search. If it found food, it will return to its friends and inform them and show them the way. The ants all varied in their contribution to the work. Some carried small pieces, and others carried pieces bigger than themselves back to their homes. I didn't know that ants drank before, but now I will save them a few drops of sweet tea, which they will drink until they swelled up. When the ants came to visit, life will creep back into my dead cell. I will feel hope instead of despair. Their presence in my company, however, was not free of danger, as the soldiers will come to inspect the cells, so I always feared for them. Before inspections, I would blow towards them, which made them disperse while I got rid of the food. They soon became accustomed to this puff of air, which became their warning signal, so that each time they felt it, they realized danger was close and ran away. When the soldiers would return me back to my cell after the search, the first thing I would look for were ant bodies. When I didn't find, I left relieved, knowing that the ants had safely escaped. After spending extensive periods of time in solitary cells, I felt that I was secluded from the rest of the world. Life and the beauty of nature began to fade from my memory. I was not able to take more than 3 medium steps in my cell until I stopped at the steel wall. When I turned, I found myself in front of the steel door. A steel surrounded me and captivated me. There was no horizon, no life, and nothing to see. So I began to fly out of the cell with my thoughts and my imagination into the vast world of existence. I would put myself on the horizon, imagining that I was looking at this sun and its rays. I will travel to see birds and trees, imagine bees collecting nectar from flowers, and long for their honey. I will imagine the colors and scents of roses so that I wouldn't forget them. I travel into the scenery of colors, of clouds, as they moved through the sky, as if they were ships sailing in the still blue sky before breaking up and disappearing. I traveled to the moon, enjoying its quiet, beautiful light, which did not disturb those who wanted to sleep. I imagined the stars sailing through the darkness of night, and I felt the beauty and presence. I remember every beautiful thing that I had known or experienced in the universe. I imagined the sunrise, a ray of light drawing a line on the horizon, slowly expelling the dark of the long night. I imagined newborn plants splitting the ground, fruits emerging from their skins. I imagined leaves falling to the ground, the sea and the fish, the rocks and the corals. I imagined cattle and sheep as they grazed, and wondered how their milk could be such a brilliant white, even though the grass they ate was green. Thoughts were not restricted, even though hands and feet were shackled. I wandered in my thoughts every morning and every evening. I woke at dawn, prayed, and then escaped from my cell, my thoughts transcending the guarded doors, the razor wire, and into the vast universe. I did it so I wouldn't forget. Thank you, Ahmed Errachidi, for this beautiful text, and thank you everyone who has been listening. I hope you enjoyed the text, and I invite you also to read more of his work. And good night from Rotterdam.